We will get right back to our content, but I wanted to thank you for being such an amazing band director, that you're taking your time and listening to a band director podcast. There's many options out there, and I appreciate you very much taking in this content. I hope that you understand that your students are very lucky to have you as their band director, that you're continuing to grow, and that they are going to benefit from your improved skills as a band director. You can share this episode with any band director friends or other music education friends who can learn from this content, because good pedagogy is good pedagogy. And if you could take a moment and go to thegrowingbanddirector.com, and you'll be able to sign up on our Patreon platform to give at least $5 or $3 a month. And it helps the content continue to be created for you to help our profession grow. Let's go back to our scheduled episode. Welcome back to the Growing Band Director podcast. This is episode number 213. I'm here with Nick Pierce. Nick, how are you?
Doing all right. How about you?
Great, thanks. It's been a great day of teaching, and looking forward to hearing more about the bass from you and your story and what we can help other band directors through on their bass teaching journey. First thing I wanted to mention was I just had a question about sort of how is your what is your teaching career like? Where are you teaching? Where are you from?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the Denver suburbs in Colorado. Went to college in CU, taught in Colorado Springs for a while, and did a master's at University of Denver. Currently, I'm teaching at Platte Canyon High School, Fitzsimmons Middle School in the small town of Bailey, which is about an hour southwest of Denver, living the small school, small town life, where my house is on a dirt road and I see moose when I walk the dogs some mornings.
That's awesome. I did want to also mention I sort of thought of four other episodes that have kind of dealt with bass, a lot of things like this. So I want people to check this one out. But if they want more from other people, get your pencil real quick or put this on pause. Episode 115 with Chris Berg, episode 76 with Dick Dunscombe, episode 72 with Larry Williams. And then even though it was about guitar, Brian Rebuse, episode 207, did a ton of similar stuff I'm sure that we'll talk about here. For rhythm section too. So let's can you tell us your story about sort of how you as a non-bass player got into playing the bass, and how that might translate into picking students who would be good bass players?
Sure. So I guess my bass story is where it starts my freshman year of high school, where I was a tuba player. And tuba is still my primary instrument, and playing in the symphonic band and the marching band. And then I saw the high school jazz band play at a concert. And I thought it was one of the coolest things I'd ever heard. And I was like, oh, I got to play that. I got to be in that band next year. And I'd had a lot of piano background throughout growing up, studying piano lessons in like second grade. And I'd been doodling a bit on guitar. And I went and talked to my band director and I said, hey, I'd love to play in jazz bands next year if there's room. And he said, well, we don't really have a tuba part. And I mentioned the piano. He said, oh, we're a little spoiled for piano players right now. And in fact, the piano player then is now a professional piano player in Denver. And I said, well, I figure I play a little bit of guitar and I read bass clef, so I figure maybe I could learn bass guitar. And he said, great, here's the school's bass, have a good summer. And I spent that summer, not from a method book really, but going through the folder of last year's tunes that the previous bass player had left in the case, and just going through the warm-ups and some of the tunes that were still in there. I kind of taught myself and figured it out on as I went along the way, and then wound up playing bass guitar in school jazz band through my senior year. And just kind of share what I think there's to learn from that is the things that I had going for me that made me, in my opinion, not to toot my own horn, the perfect new bass player for this program was, again, that bass clef background, the interest. Like I asked to join jazz band, I wanted to be there. I had that piano background, so I understood whole steps, half steps. I even understood triads and basic chords. And I think this is a big one. I don't think I mentioned before. I, at the time, was also playing keyboard in my church's youth group worship band, which meant I was familiar with playing with a drum set and with just reading off of chords, not having to necessarily think about, oh, what's the right note,
Right.
just what's in the chord. And I was also familiar with listening both to recordings and watching other people in the band play and follow their hands for the chord changes, which in retrospect is like, oh wow, I was all set up to be successful without even knowing that I was.
During the the session with Chris Berg, one of the things he talks about is like a kid with a good sense of time. Like,
Mhm.
is I mean, I wouldn't say that anything is a must, right?
Mhm.
Every kid is different, but like that's a huge one. I mean, you
Mhm.
sound like, yeah, if any band director has a kid like you play tuba, you've played all these other things. Like, yes, there's your bass player, but a lot of times you don't have that perfect kid, right? I
Oh
think
yeah.
the sense of time, and Chris Berg talked about having someone who is slightly stubborn, that like they're going to lay it down where it should be. And sometimes he said sometimes the bass player and the drummer don't get along if they're both stubborn, but having that sort of attitude about like knowing they're playing all the time and they're kind of in charge. Excelsior Music Publishing is proud to sponsor the Growing Band Director podcast with a roster of imaginative composers, including composers who have been featured on this podcast, such as Carol Britton Chambers, Laura Estes, and Tyler Arcari. Excelsior Music Publishing provides new music for concert band, jazz ensemble, solo and ensemble, as well as books and resources for all levels and occasions, including a large and festive selection of music for your fall, holiday, and Christmas concerts. Find your perfect next piece at excelsiamusic.com. That's EXCELCIA music.com.
I think you're right about the stubbornness. I look at my program right now and the bass player, the seventh grade bass player I have, and there have definitely been times where he's wanted. I've been like, "Oh, let's ease back. Just play the root on a whole note, and you'll be fine." And he's like, "No, I'm going to figure it out." And then a week later,
Yeah,
he's got it.
that's awesome.
So that stubbornness, I think you're absolutely right about that.
I think a big thing, over my career, I've been teaching 22 years or so, and I've like had to start a lot of bass players who knew nothing. I mean, they were good clarinet players or flute players, but they ended up playing bass, right? And I think you can get over the bass clef thing for a kid who's smart and can learn
Oh,
that.
sure.
I think one thing that directors need to do is literally take the bass home or in their prep period and literally figure out, okay, this is a B flat blues. This is the tune we're playing. What's a pattern I can play on the bass within an hour or so? And then so that's the one I'm going to teach my kid, right? Like the way I did it. And, it's worked for me. I'd love to hear anything else you have in addition as well. Like, playing quarter notes on the whole notes, then half notes, then quarter notes on the root is like a great place to start, right?
Yeah.
For me, the next thing I do was go to if it's in B flat, I go to the open string above that, right? Because you get the major third, so you can kind of like play with the 1 1 3 3 1, or if you go down on the same fret, you got the 1 1 5, right? Getting them to move around.
Yep.
Like I always found that, if you can get them moving from string to string without having to move their left hand, that's like a really good first step away from just playing roots. And then after that, they're probably ready for like some scalar stuff.
Yeah. And there's a lot that you can do with just that, like just again the 1 to the 3, and then the 1 to the 5 that you were saying for next chord. There's half your B flat blues right there.
Yeah.
And then and we'll get into some of the patterns later on, but you can use 2 fingers and get your way through a 12-bar B flat blues easily.
Yeah.
But and then you can move on from that to say, and then add other chord tones,
Right.
add other things. You can scaffold the complexity really effectively.
And you have to know that student well too. Like that student might want, no, here's what I'm going to work on, and I'm going to do this one. And once I get this one, then I will get that one. But you also might have the student that is like you mentioned, you give them this and they're going to come back and have learned way more than that.
Oh yeah.
Because they like the freedom.
Mm-hmm. And then you also have the kids who need the structure, and that's the kid where you go ahead and write out the arpeggios, and then explain, oh no, you can do that pattern and now just move it somewhere else, and they can extrapolate from that, but they need the structure first of having it written down.
The real message to me is like sit and play the bass. If you can't play any bass line on a bass guitar, you just haven't spent the time, because like everybody can do it. If you went to music school, you're a band director, you have a bass, you have YouTube, you can come up with a simple bass line that you can play. And if you can play it and you have a beginner, then you can teach them. It's just like sitting down and playing drum set or chords or on the piano or guitar. Like it's the same thing. The physically doing it is really important. You can't just go, here's a bass part and then hope that they get it, unless it's that special kid.
Yeah, and that kid does that kid does exist, and we stumble on them every now and then. But I agree, you have to be able to play it. And I'll also say that, especially teaching a small school setting, being able to play electric bass has helped me out a lot. I have yet to. We do a musical every year at my school. I have played bass while directing the pit every year since I've been here.
That's great. One thing I want to mention too, if you have a kid who's playing bass and maybe they don't fit in anywhere else, or you can spare them, a lot of times you can use them in your wind band too. Like I know a lot of people would say no electric bass in the wind band. I'm not saying it's the purest sound. Like for my group, I use all upright basses for the wind band sound when I have a bass player. But if the kid plays nothing else and say they're your 12th percussionist, but they're also playing bass in the jazz band, we'll put them on the tuba part, and then they'll grow out of that too.
Yep. And worth mentioning, most beginning band method books these days do include an electric bass book. I know Essential Elements does. I know the Habits book does, or I believe the Habits book does. I believe the Sound Innovations does. I'd have to actually look at the rest of the C, but it's very common now. And sure, it might not be the most... Some things don't apply right away, like the breathing and tonguing. Obviously, if you're using your tongue on the bass, you're doing something terribly wrong, as I tell my kids.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't want to do whole first suite and use an electric bass, ideally. But you know what? Ideally. Like, some bass is better than nothing, especially if you don't have 4 tubas, which most of us don't have.
Oh yeah,
getting a bass there that can blend the sound with that obviously will help. Will help everybody. So
yeah. And I'd say it's better to it would be better to have a bass player playing the whole suite and give the rest of the band the experience of playing that piece than to say, oh, we can't play Holst because we don't have tubas.
Yep. Austin Custom Brass is a proud sponsor of today's podcast. They can be found online at austincustombrass.biz. The Austin Custom Brass shop is located in Kansas City, Missouri. They're frequent attendees at MEAs around the country, including a TMEA in Texas and Kansas and Missouri. They go to Midwest and Chicago and International Trumpet Guild. And give them a call today at 816-410-0826. If it's anything brass, they have it. Beginner to professional. This is a startup company from many years ago that's grown and grown and grown. Trent Austin has done a fantastic job with this. They're great people. They have many types of instruments from Adams to Rath trombones and Shires and Getzen and Edwards and Schilke and Lotus and Courtois and many, many more. They have many new and pre-owned instruments. You can check them out online again at austincustombrass.biz. They also offer a great selection of high-quality, budget-conscious brass instruments for students and band programs, including being the exclusive dealer for Manchester Brass, great company. They also offer Brasspire, Carroll Brass, John Packer, Y. Fort, and of course, their own wonderful line of instruments, a Austin Custom Brass Doublers line. Give them a call today at 816-410-0826 and find out why they can help you grow as a brass player. There are remarkable resources for all brass players, and they will do POs and work within your budget for your band program to get you what you need for your kids. Thoughts about recommendations for actual guitars, for bass guitars that you think people should get? Maybe, and keep everybody in mind, right? Like maybe some high end, some intro level stuff.
Sure. I'd say the best choice and the standard choice for use is definitely the Fender Jazz Bass or Fender J Bass, which has been copied repeatedly. Many different brands have their own version of the J Bass, and what's the distinctive thing about it is going to be, if you look on mine here, the two, if you can see it, the two parallel pickups that are the thin rectangles. That's the most definitive thing. Part of what makes it so useful is because it does have those two parallel pickups in different places. The pickup closer to the fretboard is going to get a darker sound. The pickup further away from the fretboard gets you a brighter, not quite tinnier sound, but that's the best word I'm thinking of right now. Yeah. Having both gives that bass a lot of flexibility. And generally speaking, the different knobs on the bass, one of them will adjust the volume on one pickup, and one will adjust the volume or the tone production on the other pickup. So just by turning those knobs, you can get a lot of flexibility and a lot of different sounds from one bass.
And if somebody's... Go ahead.
For as far as price point goes, a true Fender J Bass could run you low end 500 or so, and then you can get all the bells and whistles and get higher than that. Or what you can do is get a Squire, which is actually what I have here.
Yep.
Squire is a company owned by Fender. They make the exact same designs as Fender, but with cheaper materials. So it'll be a cheaper quality wood. It'll be cheaper metals for the tuning pegs and for the knobs and everything. So it's not as quite nice as electronics, but it's the same basic setup and build, and will get you really close to that same sound. And if you get into like real gearheads in the bass world, a lot of them will buy a Squire, replace the the pickups, the electronics, the tuning knobs, etc. on their own and trip it out and be like, oh, I have a Fender J bass that cost me half the price, completely ignoring how much the extra materials cost and the time. Right. But yeah, you don't have to be that kind of gearhead to get a good quality.
So
bass.
If you think about it, if we go $500, well, a bass clarinet's, I'm not going to say the price, 15, 18, wherever you are. So you can get 3 of these for a bass clarinet. Obviously it's way less than other instruments, but that 500 might be worth getting. But then, hey, if you have 2 kids who want to start, or maybe you want to get one for a kid and you want to have one to play, then going the Squier route, you get 2 for the price of 1.
Yep, exactly. And there are other companies that make high quality basses as well. Many of them copied in some way from the Fender designs. Ibanez is a solid company. Mark Bass has come out recently with some new things. The bass I played in high school was a Dean that the school owned. Mm-hmm. And then I eventually bought an Ibanez starter pack that was like $150 back. This was back in the day. They're more expensive now. And they even sold them at Costco or something, but it was a legitimate brand. Wow. That you could get for $150, $200. And I had that to practice on at home.
My school also has some of the fretless electric uprights, mm-hmm. And if people haven't seen those, they're basically like the stick bass, and they plug in. You can use an amp and all that, but it does get a kid kind of ready for the big bass, and those are much cheaper than a big bass too. So if you want to like train a kid to start go to the upright, that's a good way to go too.
Yep. I also know that pit orchestra musicians for musicals will often have one of those, just because space is at such a premium in a lot of pits.
Yep. I want to mention something that I use as a cheater on guitar and bass, and mm-hmm. you can disapprove of it, and it's okay if you do. But as a trumpet player who has a very simple mind, when I have to learn bass, I want to know that, like, okay, here's my major scale pattern. I can play the whole scale, and we'll talk about patterns here in a second. But I know that if I just go up a fret, I'm now on F, now I'm on F sharp, and now I'm on G. And I love the fact that A flat and A feel the same, right? Like as a trumpet player, they're totally different, but as a bass player, they're the same. So I take a piece of tape right on the top of the neck. And then so when I'm looking down on it, I literally see my chromatic scale, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A. So when I want to find B flat, I know that it's here, because I just had a hard time remembering that. That's something, as long as the tape is not going to damage it, helped me a lot.
Yep. And I'm not sure I advocate for the tape, but the patterns, absolutely. Like, if you know your major scale in one position, you know it in every position. You just move up a fret, up another fret, and you can do it anywhere you want. And then when you figure out the patterns for the arpeggios and bass lines that move between different common chord progressions, then suddenly you can sound very, very good no matter mm-hmm. where you are. I am not the world's best bass player by any stretch of the imagination, but I know just enough tricks like that I can sound way better than I actually am. Mm-hmm.
So do you have any exact scale shapes you want to share with us?
Sure. So and if people are able to access the PowerPoint and the handout, I have a lot of these in there.
Yeah, we'll put that on the show notes.
Yeah. So if you start on any fret, I'm just going to start on 3rd fret on the A string. I'll mention real quick for people who are watching the video, I'm playing on a 5-string bass just because that's my preference, but you don't need to get a 5-string for your school's bass. I actually advocate against that just because it makes switching either from regular guitar or from a standard upright bass a bit more difficult. So 4-string bass for your first bass, 5-string bass comes later. About 3rd fret on the A string for a C, and then if I just go up 2 frets, and then that's the 2nd, and then go up to the 2nd fret on the next string, etc., it makes the shape of the major scale, and that's helpful by itself. But what I actually kind of default to the most isn't the major scale. I actually, and maybe this comes from my worship band background, I actually default to a power chord shape, which if you don't know what a power chord is in rock and roll, it's an open 5th. But for that shape, all it is you have your root wherever you are, go up 2 frets and over a string, and that's a 5th. And if you start with that shape, you can do a lot of things right away. Like, most obvious being right there's your bossa nova pattern in jazz band. Or if I'm improvising on a rock beat and I want more than just that repetitive pattern, there's a lot I can do right there. But then if I take that root and that fifth, and then I stay on the same fret but go over one more string, I hit the octave. If my bass is in tune, at least. And then suddenly I have that samba pattern. And I can do a lot right there for walking as well. Or another way I can think of it is, once again, 1 through 5, 1. But if I have the 1 go on the same fret, octave string the other way, and that's the fifth down an octave. So right away, I have do, so, do, and do, so, do. And there's a lot you can do right there. So even if I'm playing just with some kind of rock progression, I'll often just use that fifth down the octave to kind of embellish things. So instead of just going, I'm going to go. And I remember one specific example I use, and I think it's in the handout, is a Broadway show I played a couple times, or a musical I played a couple times, was Aida, the Elton John show. And there's a song where the bass line is just going down a D-flat scale. But now I can just using those tricks, I can spice it up quite a bit. Some different things like that. So using that same general pattern to make it much more musically interesting.
Could I have you play a pattern for me that and demonstrate that has worked really well, that I've heard people really like to use when they're walking, say on a blues or something? So could you just play a major scale for me? Good. So if people can learn that major scale pattern, and if you don't know the pattern, look it up on YouTube. You can find it pretty easily. Okay.
Yep.
But what I'd like you to do now, and if you could do it like maybe half the tempo, could you include the flat 7 and the major 7? Right. So what that does for people is, first of all, they're playing like a B flat 7 or C7 or whatever it is, but that extra note in there allows them because if you play the major scale going up or the dominant scale going up, you're going to end on the root 2 on beat 4 instead of on beat 1. So if you add that extra passing tone, and you could pick another passing tone too in a different chord, that that allows you to end on the root on the top and then kind of come back down, and kids sound like $1 million. What's that called? The bebop scale? I think it's.
I feel like the bebop scale needs the minor third too, doesn't it? I forget. I'm drawing a blank now.
I think this is called the major bebop, is what it's called.
Okay. Yeah. But I agree, and I think part of the trick to sounding hipper than you actually are is always, when possible, approaching the next chord by half step. Or if you can't do that, approach it by some other strong interval. So, for example, what I might do let's say I'm going from B flat to an E flat to the first 2 chords of a 12-bar blues. I might go first 3 notes of the scale, jump up to the 5th, and then go down. Or what I could do is go arpeggio, down a half step, and now I've landed on the new root, and it sounds way more interesting.
Yeah.
And that last one was E flat to G, go up chromatically to the B flat. And it sounds way more interesting than going, etc.
And one thing you can do as like a first step on that is, if kids have a bass line that they have, change every beat 4 to a half step above the next beat 1, right? So they can take it and then just alter that one. So you're getting that beat 4 is just a chromatic note to count 1. And when they get used to that, then they can make it even more complicated from there. What do you recommend for amps if people are getting maybe they don't have a bass amp and they want to get something that's a bang for their buck and good for their program?
The best brands, in my opinion, are probably Ampeg, Acoustic, and Fender. Fender has a lot of great products for basses as well for amplifiers. Ampeg is the one I've always personally wanted, but it's a little bit pricier than the others. Acoustic is what I have and what I'm playing on back here right now. Any of them will get a good get you a quality sound. A combo amp is plenty. A combo amp is when the controls are on the same box as the speaker, as opposed to where you have the speaker and then the separate preamp that's in a separate item. For size, I think that something in the 50 to 100 watts range is plenty for most programs. Unless you're using your bass regularly, like on the marching band field, then it makes more sense to go up to higher volume things. But yeah, 50 to 100 watt amps, something in that range is usually going to be plenty, in my opinion. Especially because as much as you want that bass sound, you don't want it to overwhelm the sound of the rest of the band. And when you bring electronic instruments and amplification into an otherwise acoustic setting, it's really easy to have that problem.
That is a great segue, because I was just going to mention volume. The first thing I would say, for not having heard everybody else's bands who's listening, I would say 90% of you need to tell your bass player and guitar player to turn down.
Yep.
Because it's so easy to have it loud, and it's, as a band director, if you hear something loud that sounds good, we'd like more of that, right? But the thing is the rhythm section is supposed to be an accompaniment to the horn line. So have them turn down. The rule of thumb that I've learned over the years of doing the podcast is listen to the piano player. If they can hear the piano player, they're probably at a pretty good volume. But at the same time, the band needs to hear the bass player. In fact, when I'm doing a sound check on stage, I'll ask the kids on my right side of the jazz band, as we're warming up, hey, can you hear the bass? Can you hear the bass definitively? And say, oh no, I can't. Then maybe we have to turn up the treble a little bit to hear the front of the sound on the attack, or maybe it just needs to be louder, because not enough bass is definitely a problem, but too much bass is just as big of a problem.
Yeah, a couple tricks I found that help with that is, first, if you have a amp on that smaller end, especially, get the amp up off the floor, put it in a chair or something, so that it's closer to the bass player's head and they can hear it more clearly.
Behind them, so they can hear it, not in front of them.
Yep, behind them, yeah. Not just so that they can hear it, but also a little trick. If the amp is behind the bass player's literal body will absorb a bit of the sound, which will help as well. And I think there's other physics reasons why it's good to have the amp up off the floor, but not a physicist, so I don't know. And
at the same time, I have a T-shirt that I made and I gave to a friend for as well. It says, "Soft, simple music is good." And when your bass player turns down, guess what? Your band can play softer too. They're not just shouting over each other all the time.
Yep, it's so easy to forget about the horn to forget about the rhythm section. We're talking about dynamics in your band and just almost treat them like you're playing along with the neighbor salt, especially if you do play along with neighbor salt sometimes. Yeah. But the bass player and the drummer probably control the dynamic range of the band more than anyone else.
I'm really glad you said that. We should talk about that a little bit too. Like, yeah, first of all, get your drummer. I'll say drummer first, but get the drummer to play soft. Get the drummer to play the right dynamic. Because if the drums are playing loud, the horns are probably going to play loud. Okay. And if the drum's playing soft, the horns are probably going to play soft. And another level of that too is if there's a dynamic change happening, the drummer needs to forecast that a measure or two ahead of time, right? So that's the drummer in my bands gets 80% of the attention, because if they're doing the dynamics and all the things right, then it's going to help everybody else. And that bass player, isn't it really nice when they're good friends with a drummer? That happens sometimes, and that's pretty great.
Yep. I always, not like best of friends, but I always got along well with the drummers I've gotten to play with, and that's always helped a lot.
I love that. Yep. So what are some typical amp levels that you'd recommend?
So it's very tempting for a lot of bass players to crank the bass, especially if they're coming to you from a rock background, like they play in a garage band or something. I find that 9 times out of 10, the bass needs to come down and the treble needs to come up for clarity. And if you get a new amp, new bass, a new player, and you're trying to figure out the levels, I would say take the treble, the highs, the lows, and the mids, and start with everything straight up, and then adjust from there. I can show you real quick. Here's me. Everything on the bass pointed straight up, and here's the sound I get. Still a decent sound. It's clear, which is good. But if I turn the treble down, and the bass up, we get more of this sound, which is very warm, but especially in a big hall, you're going to lose a lot of clarity, and it's just going to be a wash of sound. If I turn the bass back down to straight up, turn the treble to about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock on a clock face, we get more, let's say 2:30, we get more of this sound. Very clear, but a little bit dry. I boost the bass a little more. So let's say bass is at 1 o'clock, treble's at about 2 o'clock, 2:30, and mids are still straight up, by the way. Again, more body, but clarity, and that's the important thing. And if you listen to a lot of really good bass players, Victor Wooten, Jaco Pastorius being good examples, they have a lot more trouble in their sound than you'd expect, but it's so that the articulation and the precision and the rhythm are come across cleanly.
And also keep in mind, when you leave rehearsal and you know where those knobs are on the amp, when you come back the next day or the next time you see that amp, if you see those knobs cranked all the way up, that means somebody else is playing that without you knowing it, and they're changing all the settings. Don't let that happen.
Yep.
Thoughts about some maintenance and care for the bass?
Yep. I think strings is the thing that comes to mind the most immediately, and I think guilty secret that I know I share with many other bass players, I don't change my strings nearly as much as I should. Luckily, unless your kid's really playing loud or they're using a really heavy pick, they're probably not. Your strings will probably last several years before you need to worry about changing them. One maintenance issue that caught me by surprise in high school was I did not know that my school's bass had active pickups, which is where they use a 9-volt battery to power the pickups. And I did not find this out until intermission at the school's musical when the bass suddenly stopped working. So check your school's bass, and if you're using a school bass, and make sure that you know whether it's active or passive. If you're buying a bass, I highly recommend just get passive pickups that don't need a battery. It's just one less thing to worry about. And if you do have an active pickup bass, make sure you have those 9-volt batteries on hand.
Love that.
Yeah. And then the other maintenance issue that comes up frequently, and actually had to have adjusted on my bass recently, is a truss rod adjustment, which is when the neck of the bass bows out or bows up, so you have to press the strings down harder in order to make contact with the fretboard. When you have to do that, you can actually bend the strings out of tune, so you're losing intonation there, and it takes more work to press down the strings. A truss rod adjustment is something that, first of all, you have to do with all kinds of guitar-based instruments. It's not something that you can do yourself unless you have the right equipment for it, because it's where, on my bass, I have to remove the strings, remove this little panel here, and then get in there with a special screwdriver to turn the truss rod the right way to take the bowing out of the neck. I recommend just sending into a shop for that. But it's something, if you start hearing like, oh wow, my bass is out of tune when the player's playing in the middle of the neck, that's something that I recommend looking out for.
Nick, thank you so much for the time. Hope this has helped a lot of people.
Yep. Thank you.
We sincerely appreciate you taking your valuable time and listening to the Growing Band Director podcast. Your students are very lucky to have a band director like you. If you have any suggestions for episode topics or think you have an area of expertise to share on a show with us, please reach out. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to help spread the word, please give us a 5-star review and tell your band director friends to subscribe as well. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, our YouTube channel, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening to The Growing Band Director. See you next week.